Hi, everyone, and welcome to the English podcast with Mandy and Mark. I'm Mandy.
And I'm Mark. We're so glad you're joining us today.
In each episode, we break down a new aspect of English to make learning fun and accessible for you. Stick around until the end for some interactive exercises where you can test what you've learned, and feel free to ask us questions in the comments section.
Today, we're tackling a super practical topic, especially if you're traveling or new to a place. Asking for directions? We'll be covering useful phrases and vocabulary to help you find your way around.
By the end of this episode, you'll be able to confidently approach anyone and ask for directions in English. Let's get started. You know, Mark, I remember when I first traveled abroad, not knowing how to ask for directions was a big source of anxiety for me. It seems like such a simple thing.
I can totally relate to that, Mandy. It can be intimidating to approach strangers in a new place, let alone in a different language. But it's amazing how quickly those fears disappear once you learn a few key phrases.
Absolutely. Even just starting with a simple, "excuse me," can make a world of difference.
Right. It's all about being polite and respectful when you're asking for help. People are generally happy to point you in the right direction.
So true. Do you remember any particularly memorable experiences asking for directions? I once ended up having a lovely conversation with a local in Italy after asking for directions to a museum. They even gave me some extra tips on things to see there.
That's awesome. It's amazing how a simple question can sometimes lead to unexpected connections. For me, I remember being completely turned around in London once. I asked a friendly shopkeeper for help, and they not only gave me directions but also drew me a little map on a napkin. It was so thoughtful.
People can be so kind. I think it highlights the importance of clear communication when asking for directions. What are some phrases people can use to describe where they need to go?
Well, besides saying the name of the place, you can use phrases like, "How do I get to?" or "Can you tell me the way to?" These are simple and direct.
Definitely. And if you're not sure whether you're on the right track, you can always ask, "Am I going in the right direction for?"
Exactly. And don't hesitate to ask for clarification if you didn't understand something. You can say, "Could you repeat that, please?" Or, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that."
It's always better to ask twice than to end up lost.
For sure. And using landmarks can be super helpful too. Saying things like, "It's near the big church," or "It's opposite the park," can give people a better visual reference.
That's a great tip, Mark. Sometimes those visual cues are easier to follow than street names.
I think so too. And don't forget about using prepositions like next to, across from, or between to be more specific about the location.
All these phrases are so useful. I'm sure our listeners are already feeling more prepared to navigate a new city.
I hope so. Remember, the key is to be polite, clear, and confident in your communication. And don't be afraid to ask for help. People are usually happy to assist.
Well said, Mark. Now, how about we dive into some specific vocabulary that might come in handy when asking for directions?
Sounds like a plan. Let's break down some of those useful words and phrases.
Before we move on, let's take a moment to look at some of the key vocabulary we used while talking about asking for directions. It might be helpful to jot these down in your notebook as we go along.
Great idea. Mandy, I think a good one to start with is "excuse me." This is what you say to politely get someone's attention before you ask your question.
Absolutely. Next up, we have directions. Directions are the instructions or information that tell you how to get to a specific place. For example, you ask for directions to the nearest coffee shop.
And what about approach? We talked about approaching strangers. This means to go up to someone with the intention of talking to them.
Good one, Mark. Landmark. Landmarks are easily recognizable places or structures that can help you find your way. Think of things like a famous building, a statue, or a large park.
Let's not forget opposite. Opposite means directly across from something else. For example, the bank is opposite the post office.
Right. We also talked about being turned around. This means being disoriented or confused about your location or the direction you should be facing.
And if you want someone to repeat themselves, you can politely say, "Could you repeat that, please?" This just means you would like them to say it again.
Yes. And if you're unsure whether you're going the right way, you can always ask, "Am I going in the right direction?" This is a simple way to check if you're on the right track.
And lastly, clarification is when you ask for something to be explained more clearly or in more detail. So if the directions are confusing, don't hesitate to ask for clarification.
Those are all really helpful words and phrases for anyone who wants to master asking for directions in English. Keep practicing, and you'll be navigating new places with ease.
Now, let's test your listening skills with a few questions about our conversation today. Don't worry, they're not too tricky. Be sure to share your answers in the comments below. We love hearing from you.
All right, question number 1. What did Mark say was a big source of anxiety for him when he first traveled abroad?
Number 2. Mandy mentioned a positive experience she had while asking for directions. Where was she when this happened?
Great question, Mark. For our third question, what did Mark use to help him find his way when he was lost in London?
Last but not least, what are some examples of landmarks you might use when asking for directions?
So, today we covered a lot of useful phrases for asking for directions like, "Excuse me, how do I get to?" and "Am I going in the right direction?" Remember, being polite and using clear, simple language is key.
And don't forget about those helpful prepositions like next to, across from, and between. Using landmarks can also make your directions much easier to understand.
We also learned some essential vocabulary like approach, landmark, opposite, and clarification. Keep practicing these words and phrases, and you'll be well on your way to mastering the art of asking for directions. That's it for today's episode of the English Podcast with Mandy and Mark. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more English learning content. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode and any questions you might have in the comments below. See you in the next one.